Today's Tanya is at the beginning of Perek Tes of Shara Yichud Ve'emunah. It's on Daf Pei Vav Amud Aleph, and the number at the bottom of the page is 326. In the previous chapter, Perek Ches, the Rebbe describes how in the human condition, in the created condition, there are 5 steps from the highest to the lowest, from Chochmah down to action. And Chochmah is the highest of all created conditions, so we understand how far removed Chochmah is from action by considering how far action is from speech, and speech from emotion, and from thought, and thought from emotion, and emotion from seichel. So we understand that action is totally insignificant compared to Chochmah. That's in the created condition. Now, beginning of Perek Tes. But for God, Madregas HaChochma, this level of Chochmah, Shehit Chilas Machshava V'Reishiso, which is the beginning of thought and the origin of it all, His Seif Maise is the end of action at slave for God. Hainu, this means Shenechsheves Ki'ilu Hi Bechinas Umadregas Asiya L'Gabi HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that in God's perspective, relative to God, Chochmah is considered as lowly and as insignificant as action. Kidechsiv, as we find written, Kulam B'Chochmah Asisa, God made them all with wisdom. But the Alter Rebbe says that implies V'hainu Leimar, what this tells us is Sheke'erech HaChayu Shebe'asiya Gufnis V'Gashmis, that the value of the physical act, the life and the energy of an act, a bodily act, a physical act, Le'erech Chayis HaChochma, compared to the life and the energy of Chochma, Shehi Reishis U'Mokir HaChayis Ba'odam V'Chol HaBruim Gashmim, Chochma being the beginning and the source of all life for the human being and for all created beings, physical beings. So when we compare the action to the Chochma, we find Shehu Ka'ayin L'Gabi Chayu Shebe'esiyis HaDibur, Shehu Ka'ayin L'Gabi Chayu Shebe'esiyis HaMachshava. The action energy is insignificant even compared to the energy in speech. And the energy in speech is insignificant as nothing compared to the energy of thought. And the letters and words of thought are insignificant and are non-existent, as if they weren't, compared to the energy of the emotion which invests the thought and gives it its energy and its life. Shehu ke'ayin legabe chayis u'mailus u'madregas ha'chochma bino das mokir hamnideis, and the energy of the emotion is as nothing and insignificant compared to the chochma bino das, the intelligence that is the origin of the emotion. Kain mamash, in exactly the same way, erech madregas u'mailus ha'chochma, that's how insignificant the level of Chochmah is, which in the worlds, Chochmah is the beginning and source of all life, but but compared to God Himself, who is removed and higher, tens of thousands upon thousands of levels. Infinitely higher than Chochmah is higher than compared to action. Because Chochmah is higher than action only 5 levels. Chochmah is 5 levels higher than action. Shehein Madreges What are those 5 levels? Action, speech, thought, emotions, intelligence. Aval HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but God is Rom u'misnasim mimadreges ha'chachma, but God is removed and higher than the level of chachma, revoves madreges, ke'elu ad ein ketz. God is removed thousands, tens of thousands of levels, such as the levels that remove and separate chachma from asiya. But in God, those levels are infinite, ad ein ketz. In other words, the distance between these 5 attributes in the human condition, the difference between thought and speech, between action and speech, between emotion and intellect, although there's a progression from one to the other, from seichel to midos, from midos to thought, from thought to speech, from speech to action, although there is that progression, but the progression takes giant steps. There are real gulfs between each of them. For example, seichel and midos, although the midos come from the seichel, and the seichel is the source of the midah, yet there's a giant step that has to be taken from one to the other, because they're not only different, but in fact opposites. They have opposite tendencies. Seichel basically takes the person into himself, whereas midos, emotions, take the person out of himself. So there's a big gulf between them. They're going in opposite directions. Then we have thought and speech, also the same thing. Thought takes the person into himself. Speech takes the person out of himself, away from himself. And all of this is between people. Either you're thinking for yourself or you're dealing with another person. Action is different from all of the rest. There's a giant step between speech and action, although speech is also outside of oneself, but it still remains within the human realm. You speak to a human being, whereas action takes you into contact with objects. You act on an object, which is a giant step from speech. But the distance between the collective difference from action all the way to chachma is a giant step made up of 5 gulfs, 5 gaps. So it's a giant step 5 times over. That kind of gulf exists between God and chachma, only infinite levels, infinite times. So God is removed from chachma in the same way that chachma is removed from action, but infinitely more so. And as the Rebbe will say, why then do we even describe the difference between God and chachma as being similar to the difference between chachma and asiya, chachma and action? It's because we have no other example. In the created condition, we have no better example for a distance between conditions. Chachma being the highest condition and action being the lowest condition, we can't create a better example than that, although it is in fact a poor example. In today's Hayom Yom, the 28th of Sivan, the Rebbe writes that the Tzemach Tzedek once related to his son, my grandfather, meaning the Rebbe Marash, an incident in his life, an event that happened, and he concluded by saying that when one helps another Jew with parnasa in his livelihood, even if he helps him to earn a mere 70 kopecks, which was a very low-valued coin in Russia, to earn 70 kopecks in the sale of a calf, the merit of that mitzvah brings him that the gates of all the heavenly courts are open. Years went by, and my grandfather related the whole thing to my father, the Rebbe Marash related it to the Rebbe Rashab, and the Rebbe Marash added that although it is necessary to know the paths to these divine heavenly gates, but it's not crucial. What is crucial is, the main thing is, to help another Jew with wholeheartedness, with a feeling, and to have pleasure in doing another Jew a favor.